Greetings, young scientists, and welcome to the beginning of our unit on evolution. Uh, Evolution is our penultimate unit for the year. We'll take some time going through evolution and talking about Darwin, and we'll talk about the Galapagos finches, and we'll talk about species evolving over time. And after this unit, then we'll do some ecology in here, and then we're going to get close to wrapping up the biology curriculum for the year, but fret not. If we are not in school, I'm still going to find a way for us to do virtual frog dissections. And hopefully we'll be able to do some other things that have some interest of you in the biological world. So this is going to be our unit on evolution. We'll talk about Charles Darwin. We'll talk about mutations and how they are the driver for evolution. We'll talk about human evolution as well. We'll talk about the difference between theories and laws in this unit, and we'll also talk a little bit about scientific certainty in this unit as well. So we can't talk about evolution without talking about Charles Darwin. It is important to note that just like Watson, Crick, and Rosalind Franklin, Charles Darwin simply discovered the mechanism for evolution. He did not invent evolution. He simply is the person that discovered the mechanism. You will find that there were others around his time who also discovered the mechanism, but got it a little bit off in terms of how evolution actually works. I believe we spent a fair amount of time in this class talking about mutations, that is, mutations at the genetic level. If you remember adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, you can have mutations in DNA, you can have mutations in messenger RNA, in transfer RNA, and we can talk about how those mutations drive species change over time. It's very important to think about this when we talk about evolution, that evolution is a scientific theory. But remember that the word theory, the way that we use it in everyday vernacular or everyday conversation, is not the way that scientists use the word theory. A theory in science is a hypothesis that has never been disproven using physical evidence. Now remember, I know at some point there's somebody out there that's asking the difference between a theory and a law. Generally speaking, the easy way to remember it is laws can be observed directly, theories can be observed indirectly, although when we talk about evolutionary theory, we will be talking about some direct evidence that we can see today, even in the modern world, of species evolving. So if we go all the way back to the 1800s, around the time of Darwin, this will be in the early 1800s, there were generally some basic explanations as to how we got to where we are in terms of life here on Earth. Many people thought that organisms were created in one time and in one place. And at around the 1800s, scientists started to question that. And they said, well, wait a minute, if everything was created at one time, how come when we look at fossils, we see organisms on Earth, and that's right, you can think dinosaurs, that were on the Earth back in the day, millions of years ago, but we don't see them on the Earth today. It kind of poked a little hole in that everything might be created at one time. Scientists also looked at the wide variety of species around the world, and they asked the question, well, if everything was created in one place, how can we see this grand variety of species all across the Earth? And not only that, how can we see these adaptations in species where each species is uniquely adapted to the environment that they are in? So if each species is different, also, why do we see these same fundamental structures throughout species, all throughout the animal kingdom? And you can also think plant kingdom as well. So Charles Darwin, born in 1809, he was born in the United Kingdom. He wanted to become a doctor, but did not like the sight of blood, so he became a biologist. He was a naturalist on the boat, the HMS Beagle. And the big picture with the Beagle, if you look at all those places that Darwin went, you can see there on the left-hand side of the globe, he stopped in the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands are 700 miles west off the coast of Ecuador. And it was there when he was at the Galapagos Islands, and we'll look at a video with this a little bit later, that he saw all sorts of these wild animals like marine iguanas and giant sea tortoises. But out of all the organisms that he saw, when he finally got home from his trip, it was the simple finch. It was the beak on the finch that kind of piqued his interest in that species might change over time. And the thing to look at, if you look at those finches there, you can see that their beaks are different. And some are different in terms of thickness, some are different in terms of their length, and we'll talk a little bit more about that and how each species got that, or how each species of finch got that unique beak there. So, Charles Darwin, who was he? He was a biologist. He was born in the United Kingdom, and he took a trip on the HMS Beagle. Out of all the places that he went to, the Galapagos is the one that's one of the most famous places that he visited, and it was there that he first got the inklings of discovering the mechanism of how species change over time. Before we get to Darwin's discovery, it's important to note that Darwin took some ideas from some scientists and from some economists who were around at his time, and he kind of used their influence to help discover the mechanism of evolution. So one of them is going to be Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. The other one for you social studies heads out there is Thomas Malthus. You may have heard of him in social studies class. Charles Lyell and James Hutton, you may have heard of them from environmental science last year. And Georges Cuvier, who was another biologist and an environmental scientist. So if you look at Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, that's the dude there with that sweet haircut, looks like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. I could go either way on that. Either way, Lamarck was kind of one of the first guys that said, hey, wait a minute, I think that species might change over time. And in fact, it is true. Species do change over time, and we have the fossil evidence. The classic example of this would be giraffes and their necks. We have fossils of giraffes with short necks. We have fossils of giraffes with intermediate necks, and we also have fossils of giraffes with really long necks. And it was Lamarck who theorized that maybe giraffes stretch their neck over time. And in fact, now what we know about DNA evidence, we found out that this is not the case, that Lamarck understood that species changed over time, but he got the mechanism wrong. And what he really thought was that there was one individual giraffe, and you can see it there in our bottom right-hand corner. He thought that there was one individual giraffe that constantly kept stretching its neck higher and higher and higher and higher. And finally, that giraffe had a really, really long neck, and then it passed that long neck onto its offspring. And that is not the case. So the things that you do during your life, you can think about lifting weights or getting a tattoo. Don't get a tattoo without your parents' permission. But if you think about those are things that we cannot pass on to our offspring. They are not genetic traits. They are traits that we have acquired over our lifetime. So Lamarck thought that the traits that we acquired could get passed on to our offspring. Correct that we do change over time. Incorrect in that these traits that we acquire during our lifetime, we pass on. Thomas Malthus, if you look at that graph there in the bottom left-hand corner, no, it is not a coronavirus graph. It is essentially a graph of human population, and all Malthus said is that when we look at all populations here on Earth, that populations will continue to grow until they run out of either food or they run out of shelter. And so you can see the human population right now, it's going up. If you remember from last year, you may have talked about carrying capacity. The carrying capacity of our planet right now, many scientists think is somewhere between 13 and 14 billion people. We're at about 8 billion people right now. It's kind of important to remember too that if people tell you, well, there's not enough food on Earth for all the people that we have right now, that is not true. There is more than enough food for all the people on Earth right now. But remember, it's things like poverty and oppressive regimes that kind of keep many people from getting the food that they actually need. Charles Lyell and James Hutton, all they said was that environments tend to change over time. You might remember Pangea from 9th grade science. That was that big supercontinent, and you can kind of see how the continents fit together like a puzzle piece. Charles Lyell and James Hutton said that over long periods of time, environments tend to change. And in fact, we can actually see today that that is true. Georges Cuvier said, well, that is true. Environments do change over time, but every now and then we can have some sort of catastrophic event. You can see the picture of the volcano here. You can also think of an asteroid hitting Earth. You can have a catastrophic event that changes environments very, very quickly. So sometimes the environment changes very, very slowly, but then sometimes the environment changes very, very quickly as well. So Here's the major contributors that helped Darwin discover the mechanism for evolution. Lyell was the one who thought that environments changed over time, and we have a vast amount of evidence for that. Thomas Malthus suggested that populations tend to increase until they run out of food or shelter. We have evidence of that. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck suggested that species changed over time. Correct on that, but not correct on how they change. And if you're wondering, well, Mr. Dell, how do these species change over time? That's what this unit is about. And Georges Cuvier, he suggested that, well, it's true that environments do change slowly over time, but every now and then there can be a catastrophic event on Earth that causes the environment to change very quickly. Well, we're coming in at about 11 minutes. I think that sounds pretty good for today. I hope that I gave you a basic introduction as to what the unit on evolution is going to be. I hope I gave you a little flavor as to who Charles Darwin is, and I'm hoping that our next video will talk a little bit about the mechanism of natural selection and evolution. I think you will find it very interesting. So until next time, I hope to see you online. Thanks a lot.